There is a city in the Bible that God destroyed personally, not through famine, not through plague, not through the slow erosion of time. He showed up, gave specific instructions, and brought the walls down himself. And then he cursed the ground, told anyone who dared rebuild it that they would pay with the lives of their own children. That should have been the end. It was not. Because centuries later, after the curse had been spoken, after the walls had been rebuilt and broken again, after kings had risen and rotted in its palaces, a man walked into that same city on foot, quietly, without an army, without a war cry, and he stopped for two people that everyone else had walked past without a second glance. One was blind and begging in the dust. The other was a wealthy traitor hiding in a tree. That man was Jesus of Nazareth. And this was his last stop before Jerusalem, before the cross, before everything. He chose to spend his final hours before the greatest sacrifice in history in a city that God had once erased from the face of the earth. Which raises a question that I have not been able to stop thinking about. Why does God keep coming back to Jericho? Why does the same city appear at the beginning of Israel's story and again at the end of Jesus' ministry? Why does the same ground that was cursed become the ground where the blind receive sight and the corrupt give back with a stone? Why does a city that has been destroyed and rebuilt more times than almost any place on earth keep pulling the story of God back to itself? The answer reaches back more than 12,000 years, to a spring of water in the lowest place on earth, to the first walls ever built by human hands, to a woman who hung a red cord from her window and changed the course of her bloodline forever, to a prophet who threw salt into poisoned water and watched it run clean, to a king who built paradise and died rotting inside it. This is not just the story of a city. This is the story of how God moves through curses and healings, through silence and sudden collapse, through the people nobody expected and the moments nobody predicted. And by the time we reach the end, when Jesus stands beneath a tree and looks up at a man the whole city despises, you will understand why he came here last. Some stories take 12,000 years to tell. This is one of them. This is what we do here. We go deep into the stories that changed everything and we let them speak. If that is what you are looking for, you are exactly where you need to be. Before there was a Bible, before there was a covenant, before there was a chosen people, a promised land, or a single word of scripture written on parchment or stone. Before any of that, there was a spring, a single source of fresh water, pushing up cold and clean through the floor of the lowest place on earth. The Jordan Valley, 270 meters below sea level. A geological scar carved into the surface of the planet so deep that the air here feels different, heavier, denser, as if the atmosphere itself has settled into the depression like water into a bowl. In the summer, this valley becomes an open furnace. The sun does not simply shine here, it presses down. The desert stretches in every direction, brown and merciless, broken only by the occasional shimmer of heat rising from cracked earth. By every measure of logic, no one should have stopped here. And yet the spring kept flowing. It had been flowing for thousands of years before the first human being ever knelt beside it. Cold, clean, inexhaustible. a gift placed in the most inhospitable geography imaginable, as if someone had hidden something precious in the last place anyone would think to look. The people we call the Natufians found it around 10,000 years before Christ. They were nomads, hunter-gatherers who had spent generations following the rhythm of the ancient world, move with the seasons, follow the herds, never stay long enough for the land to run dry. The rules of survival in that world were brutal in their simplicity. Keep moving. The moment you stop, the famine catches up with you. But here beside this impossible spring in the floor of the world, a group of them made a decision that violated millions of years of instinct. They stopped. They looked at the water. They looked at the wild grains growing along its banks. They looked at each other. And they decided that this place was worth staying for. What happened next was not just a practical decision. It was a spiritual one, though they had no framework yet to call it that. They began to build. First shelters of mud and branch. Then walls. Then something more permanent. More deliberate. The first houses in human history, structures designed not for temporary shelter but for a life rooted in one place, generation after generation. In doing so, they solved the oldest problem of human existence. The hunger problem. The uncertainty problem. The waking up every morning not knowing if today would bring food or not. But in solving that problem, they created a new one that had never existed before. A fixed target. While they were nomads, security came from movement. No one could raid what they could not find. But now, with grain stored in clay jars, with children who had never known any other home, with an entire community staked to a single geography, they were visible, findable, vulnerable in a way that their ancestors had never been. The first house of humanity created, almost automatically, the first thief. And the first thief created the first wall. The wall they built is still there. Archaeologists have excavated it, a stone tower 8.5 meters high with a perfectly carved interior staircase, connected to a massive enclosure wall 4 meters thick. Built without a single metal tool. Without the wheel. Without trapped animals. Using only stone chisels and animal horns and the sheer accumulated labor of a community that had decided this place was worth protecting at any cost. Think about what that means. Millennia before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge, before any monument we typically associate with ancient human achievement, the people of Jericho were building what amounts to a defensive skyscraper. Archaeologists still debate its exact purpose. Was it military defense against rival groups? A barrier against the catastrophic flash floods that roared down from the Judean mountains? Perhaps both. But the deeper truth is this: fear built it. Not evil fear. Not irrational fear. The very human fear of losing what you love. The fear that comes naturally and inevitably the moment you have something worth keeping. And here is what I find quietly extraordinary about that. Long before God ever spoke to Abraham, long before the covenant, long before the Torah or the temple or the long complicated history of Israel, God placed a spring of water in the lowest place on earth. And people came. They always come where life is. They built their homes around it. They raised their children beside it. They buried their dead beneath the floors of the houses they loved, literally keeping their ancestors present beneath their feet as a form of permanence, of claiming, of saying this ground is ours and we are not leaving. There is something in that impulse that runs all the way through Scripture. The desire to belong somewhere. The longing for a place that is yours, not just legally, not just geographically, but in the bone-deep way that only comes from generations of love and loss and return. God did not create that longing by accident. He placed it in us. And then He placed a spring in the desert. And then He waited for 10,000 years of history to turn before He sent His own Son walking down the road past that same spring, stopping for the people no one else would stop for, making a different kind of claim on the land that human hands had tried to hold and lost and rebuilt and lost again. The spring still flows today. The people of Jericho still drink from it. Some gifts, once given, are not taken back. But the walls are a different story. Because the people who built them believed that stone and engineering could protect everything they loved. They had not yet learned the lesson that Jericho would spend the next 10,000 years teaching. No wall built by human hands has ever been a last wall. And the question worth sitting with before we go any further is this: what have you built your walls out of? What are you protecting so fiercely that you have stopped asking whether the walls themselves have become the problem? There is a particular kind of danger that comes not from weakness but from success. Not the danger of losing everything. The danger of believing you never will. By 1700 BC, Jericho had been standing for more than 8,000 years. 8,000 years of floods survived and rebuilt. 8,000 years of seasons endured, of children born and buried, of walls repaired and raised higher after every catastrophe. The city had outlasted every threat that the ancient world had thrown at it, and somewhere in that long history of survival, something shifted. The people of Jericho stopped fearing God. They started trusting their walls instead. To understand what they built, you have to understand what the ancient world had become by 1700 BC. The era of stone tools was over. Egypt had war chariots fast, lethal, capable of covering ground that infantry could not. Mesopotamian armies had battering rams, siege towers, weapons engineered specifically to break through fortifications. The military technology of the ancient world had advanced dramatically, and every city that wanted to survive had to adapt. Jericho adapted brilliantly. Their engineers designed something that archaeologists today call a glacis, a term that does not quite capture how extraordinary it actually was. Around the base of the entire city, they constructed a massive sloping ramp of compacted earth, then coated it in a layer of white plaster so hard and smooth that it was almost impossible to climb. The angle was calculated precisely steep enough that horses lost their footing, that siege equipment could not gain traction, that enemy soldiers scrambling upward became easy targets for archers positioned on the walls above. At the top of the glacis stood a double wall, an outer retaining wall and an inner defensive wall, with houses built in the space between them. The city was essentially a fortress elevated above the surrounding plain, surrounded by a surface engineered to repel anything that tried to reach it. It was, by the military standards of its time, close to perfect. And it worked. For 300 years it worked. Jericho sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, the gateway between the great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and extracted wealth from every caravan that passed through. The city grew rich. Archaeologists have found evidence of imported goods, fine ceramics, luxury furniture. The elite of Jericho lived extraordinarily well behind their impenetrable walls. And this is where the story begins to sound uncomfortably familiar. Because Jericho is not the first city in Scripture to make this mistake. It is not the first community of human beings to look at what their own hands had built and decide that they were safe, that the walls were high enough, the engineering clever enough, the defenses sophisticated enough that nothing outside could threaten them. Go back further. Go back to the plains of Shinar, where a people who share in one language and one ambition began building a tower designed to reach the heavens. The Tower of Babel was not built out of evil. It was built out of the same impulse that built the glacis of Jericho, the belief that human ingenuity, applied with sufficient ambition, could construct a security that did not depend on God. Go to Egypt, where Pharaoh looked at the slave population of Israel and calculated that the solution to his fear of them was more bricks, more labor, more control, more walls, more system, more human architecture erected against a divine purpose. The pattern is always the same. The walls go up. The confidence grows. And then something happens that the walls cannot stop, because the threat was never coming from outside. Inside the walls of Jericho, in the gap between the outer and inner defensive wall, lived a woman named Rahab. She ran it in. The text also tells us she was a prostitute, which meant she occupied the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy of Jericho. She was the kind of person the elite behind their imported furniture and fine ceramics would not have looked at twice. She lived literally inside the structure of the city's greatest defense, and she could see what the king on his throne could not. The city was terrified. Not of the walls failing, of something else. Something that no engineer could address and no glacis could deflect. Word had been traveling ahead of the Israelites, stories of what their God had done in Egypt, what he had done at the Red Sea, what he had done to the kingdoms on the other side of the Jordan. And those stories had done something to the people of Jericho that no army had managed to do in 300 years. They had broken the city's nerve. Rahab would later tell the Israelite spies who came to her door, "Our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." Joshua 2:11. Read that carefully. This woman, this outsider, this person of no social standing, living in the wall of a city that trusted its walls above all things, had arrived at a theological conclusion that the king of Jericho had not. She had looked at the evidence of history and reached a verdict. The God of Israel was real. And real meant that no human construction was going to stop what he had decided to do. The king saw a military problem. Rahab saw a theological reality. This is the pattern God uses so consistently in Scripture that it almost becomes a signature. The people with the most power and the most to lose are the last to understand what is actually happening. And the person living in the margins, in the gap between the walls, In this space, society has assigned to the expendable as the one who sees clearly. Rahab made her decision before the walls ever fell. She hid the spies. She sent the king's soldiers in the wrong direction.
Are you sure?
And then she hung a scarlet cord from her window, a signal, a mark, a small piece of red thread that would mean the difference between life and death when the moment came. That red cord is one of the most quietly powerful images in all of Scripture. A woman who had nothing, no status, no political influence, no place inside the structures of power, hanging a thread from her window is an act of faith. Trusting not in the walls around her but in the God she had never worshipped until now. The walls of Jericho were a marvel of human engineering. They were also a monument to a very old and very human mistake, the belief that what we build with our hands can substitute for what only God can provide. 300 years of safety had produced a city that knew how to defend itself against everything except the one thing that was actually coming. Is there something in your own life that you have trusted more than you have trusted God? Something you have engineered so carefully, reinforced so thoroughly, that you have stopped asking whether He is inside the walls with you or standing outside them, waiting? Every military manual in the ancient world agreed on one thing. A siege was supposed to be allowed. Battering rams against gates. War cries designed to terrorize. Arrows and fire and the constant brutal percussion of armies trying to break through stone. The psychology of ancient warfare was built on noise, on overwhelming the enemy's senses until their nerve broke and their walls followed. Joshua knew all of this. He had grown up in Egypt. He had watched Pharaoh's armies. He understood exactly what a professional military force was supposed to look like. And then God gave him instructions that must have sounded, to every military mind in his camp, like madness. March around the city once a day for 6 days in silence. Do not say a word. No rams, no arrows, no war cries. 7 priests carrying ram's horn trumpets, the Ark of the Covenant carried behind them, and an entire army of soldiers walking in absolute silence around the walls of the most fortified city in Canaan. For 6 days. Imagine what that looked like from inside the walls of Jericho. The gates were barred. The king had ordered total lockdown, no one in, no one out. The soldiers on the walls would have watched this procession every morning with the confusion that slowly, over 6 days, curdled into something else entirely. Something harder to defend against than arrows or battering rams. Tread. Silence is one of the most powerful psychological weapons ever deployed. An army that attacks gives you something to respond to. You know what it wants. You know where it is coming from. You know how to prepare. But an army that circles you without speaking, without attacking, without explaining itself, that army is doing something to your mind that stone walls cannot protect you from. The king of Jericho was waiting for a military problem. He received a spiritual one. On the 7th day, everything changed. 7 times around the city. And then at the signal from Joshua, the silence that had been building for 6 days exploded into sound. The trumpets screamed. The army shouted. And according to the text of Joshua chapter 6, The walls of Jericho did not crack, did not crumble slowly, did not fall in pieces. They fell flat. Kathleen Kenyon, the British archaeologist who excavated Jericho in the 1950s, found something that has never fully left the conversation. At the base of the glacis, that perfectly engineered sloping defense that had protected the city for 300 years, she found a layer of collapsed mud bricks. Red bricks, fallen outward, forming, accidentally, almost exactly the kind of ramp that an invading army would have needed to walk straight up into the city. The defense had become the entrance. Was it an earthquake? The Jordan Valley sits on one of the most seismically active fault lines in the world. Was it something else entirely? The text does not explain the mechanism. It simply records the result. And the result was that the walls of Jericho, the walls that 300 years of military engineering had made as close to impenetrable as the ancient world knew how, came down on the day God had chosen, in the way God had chosen, at the moment God had chosen. Not a day earlier. Not through any strategy Joshua invented. But here is what I want you to notice. Because the collapse of the walls is the part of this story everyone remembers, and it is not the most important part. The most important part is a red cord hanging from the window. Rahab had made her choice before any of this happened. Before the first march around the walls. Before the silence began. Before the trumpets sounded. She had looked at the evidence: the God of Israel, the parting of the Red Sea, the defeat of the kings of the Jordan, and she had made a theological decision that was also a personal one. She was on the wrong side of the wall. Not the wall of Jericho. The wall that mattered was the one between the kingdom of God and everything outside it. And Rahab had already decided, quietly, with a red cord and a conversation with two strangers she had hidden on her roof, which side of that wall she wanted to be on. The instructions the spies gave her were precise. Stay inside your house. Gather your family. Keep the cord in the window. Do not go outside. And when the army of Israel enters the city, you will be safe. She obeyed. Her entire family survived. And the scarlet cord stayed in the window. Now I want you to sit with that image for a moment. Because this is not an accident of narrative. The writers of Scripture were not casual with their symbols. A red cord hung from a window, protecting the household from destruction while judgment fell on everything around it. Where have we seen that before? Go back to Egypt. Go back to the night of Passover, when the angel of death moved through the land and the households of Israel were protected by one thing: blood on the doorframe. A mark. A sign. A visible declaration of belonging that meant the difference between life and death. Rahab's cord is the same image. A woman who was not born into the covenant, who had no claim by bloodline or religion or social standing, placing a mark on her window and trusting that the God she had just decided to believe in would honor it. And he did. The book of Joshua tells us she was brought out safely with her entire family. But the story does not end there. Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, lists the ancestors of the Messiah one by one. And there, in the 5th verse, is a name that should not be there by any human calculation. Rahab. the prostitute of Jericho, the woman who lived in the wall, the outsider who hung a red cord from her window and chose the right side of history before the walls ever fell. She is in the bloodline of Jesus Christ. This is how God works. Not through the king who trusted his glacis, not through the military elite who believed their engineering was sufficient. Through a woman with nothing but a cord and a conviction that the God she had heard about from a distance was worth betting everything on. The walls of Jericho fell because God brought them down. But Rahab was saved because she made a choice. And that choice, that single act of faith from the most unlikely person in the most unlikely place, echoed forward through generations until it reached the manger in Bethlehem. No wall you have ever built is too thick for God to bring down. And no background you carry is too complicated for God to write into his story. Rahab proved both of those things. At the same time. In the same moment. Not the silence of peace. The silence of warning. Joshua had spoken a curse over the ruins of Jericho before he left. The words were specific, deliberate, and public, heard by every soldier, every survivor, every traveler who would pass through that valley in the years that followed. He said that whoever rose up and rebuilt this city would do so at the cost of his firstborn son when he laid the foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son when he set up the gates. A father's worst nightmare, spoken as a boundary marker over a pile of ash. For 500 years, it held. 500 years is not a short time. It is longer than the entire history of the United States. Longer than the gap between Columbus and today. Empires rose and fell in that span of time. Israel went from a loose confederation of tribes to a monarchy under Saul, then to its golden age under David and Solomon. Then began the long fracture that would eventually split it into two kingdoms. The world changed beyond recognition. And through all of the Jericho stayed ruins. Not because no one wanted the land. The spring was still there. The water still flowed. The geography was still exactly what it had always been, the most valuable oasis in the Jordan Valley, sitting at the crossroads of the ancient world. Every merchant who passed through that valley could see the potential. Every military strategist who looked at that spring understood what controlling it would mean. But no one built, because everyone remembered. This is something we tend to underestimate about the ancient world, a weight that words carried. Not words in the modern sense, where we produce thousands of them daily and most evaporate before the day is out. Words spoken in the name of God, by a figure of the stature of Joshua, over the ruins of a city that had just fallen in the most inexplicable military engagement anyone had ever witnessed. Those words had mass. They had gravity. They pressed down on the valley like a physical presence. The fear of the curse was more powerful than a desire for the land. For 500 years. And then came Hiel. He was from Bethel, a city in the northern kingdom of Israel, during the reign of King Ahab. And if you know anything about the reign of Ahab, you already understand the spiritual atmosphere in which Hiel made his decision. Ahab was the king who married Jezebel, who introduced Baal worship on an industrial scale into Israel, who did more to lead God's people away from the covenant than almost any king before him. The biblical text says of Ahab that he did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all the kings before him. This was the world Hiel lived in, a world where the old boundaries were being redrawn, where the old warnings were being reclassified as superstition, where pragmatism and economic ambition were replacing the fear of God as the organizing principle of public life. Hiel looked at the ruins of Jericho and saw an opportunity. He was not, by any account, a villain in the dramatic sense. He was not a conqueror or a tyrant. He was a builder, a practical man who looked at an underutilized resource and decided to develop it. The spring was there. The trade routes were there. The land was fertile. The strategic position was obvious. Whatever ancient curse had kept this valley empty for 500 years was, in his estimation, exactly that: ancient, historical, a story the old people told. He ordered the construction to begin. The book of 1 Kings records what happened next in 2 sentences so precise and so devastating that they read like a legal document. When Hiel laid the foundation of Jericho, Abiram, his firstborn son, died. And when he set up its gates, Segub, his youngest son, died according to the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua. 500 years. 2 generations of cultural drift. An entire era of spiritual compromise under Rahab and Jezebel. And the word spoken over that valley arrived exactly on schedule. Not a day late. Historians debate the nature of these deaths. Were they tragic accidents that coincided with the construction in a way that the community interpreted through the lens of the prophecy? Were they, as some archaeologists have suggested based on evidence from other Canaanite sites, intentional foundation sacrifices, a pagan practice of burying a child in the foundation of a city gate to spiritually consecrate the structure? The text does not specify the mechanism. What it specifies is the fulfillment. I want to be honest about something here, because this is the kind of passage that makes modern readers uncomfortable, and it should. A God who allows, or ordains, the death of children is the consequence of a father's ambition, is not the safe, manageable God of comfortable religion. This is the God of Joshua and of Job, the God who operates on a timeline and with a consistency that does not bend to accommodate human convenience or human griefs. The word he speaks does not expire. That is either terrifying or deeply comforting, depending entirely on which side of his purposes you're standing on. But the story of Jericho does not end with Hiel's grief, because the God who allowed the curse to stand also sent a prophet to address what the rebuilding had left behind. The city was rebuilt, but it was sick. The land was barren. The water that had sustained 10,000 years of civilization had turned bad. The spring of Elisha, the same spring that had drawn the Natufians, that had made Jericho worth fighting over for millennia, was producing water that caused death and miscarriage. The city that Hiel had rebuilt at such cost was standing, but it was not living. The people came to Elisha desperate. His response made no agricultural sense whatsoever. He asked for a new bowl. He filled it with salt. And he walked to the spring, the source, the origin point, the place where everything began, and threw the salt in. Salt kills crops. Salt poisons soil. Every farmer in that valley would have known that. What Elisha did was, by every natural logic available to him, exactly the wrong thing. And the water ran clean. The text says it has remained clean to this day. The spring of Elisha still flows in Jericho. Visitors still drink from it. After everything that has happened on that ground, the fire of Joshua, the silence of 500 years, the grief of Hiel, the poison water, the source is still producing life. This is the pattern I keep coming back to in the story of Jericho. God does not abandon the places He has touched, even the places He has judged. Even the places that have been cursed, burned, emptied, and foolishly rebuilt. He sends a prophet with a bowl of salt and does the thing that makes no sense and calls it healing. He is remarkably stubborn about restoration. And here is what I want you to carry into the next chapter. Hiel thought the curse was old news. He thought 500 years of silence meant the word had lost its power. He was wrong about that. But there is a flip side to that same truth that is far more hopeful. If the word of judgment does not expire, neither does the word of healing. Is there a place in your life that you have written off? A relationship, a wound, a season that you have decided is too old, too broken, too far gone for anything to change? The spring of Elisha was poisoned. Elisha threw salt into it, and it ran clean. What would it look like to let God do the thing that makes no sense in the place you have stopped believing in? There is a particular kind of man who looks at a cursed place and sees a renovation project. Herod the Great was that kind of man. By the time he turned his attention to Jericho sometime around 30 BC, the city had been rebuilt, had survived, had been purified by a prophet, and had slowly settled back into the rhythms of a modest trading town. The spring still flowed. The palm trees still grew. The valley was still the warmest, most sheltered piece of real estate in the entire region. And Herod, who had spent his entire reign building things that were too large, too expensive, and too obviously compensating for something, saw exactly what Jericho could become. He did not see a city with a theological history. He did not see the ground where Joshua had stood, where Rahab had hung her cord, where Elisha had thrown salt into a poisoned spring. He saw geography. He saw climate. He saw the fact that Jerusalem, sitting in the mountains 20 kilometers away, endured cold winters and heavy rain, while down here in the Jordan Valley, the air stayed warm and the sun came early. He saw a resort. What Herod built at Jericho over the following decades was, by the standards of the ancient world, staggering. He diverted the waters of the oasis to feed a complex of swimming pools, not small ceremonial baths but Olympic-scale pools, engineered for pleasure. He built a hippodrome for chariot races. He constructed a theater. He raised a series of winter palaces with mosaic floors imported from across the empire, frescoed walls, and gardens designed to make you forget you were sitting in the middle of a desert. The contrast with the surrounding landscape was not subtle. It was the point. While the common people of Judea lived under crushing Roman taxation, while the farmers scraped livings from rocky hillside terraces, while the poor crowded into Jerusalem's lower city in conditions that would be recognizable to anyone who has visited a modern slum. The elite of the Herodian court swam in heated pools and watched theatrical performances in the warm Jericho evenings. Jericho had always been a mirror, and what it reflected in this season was the image of a man who had everything and trusted nothing. Because that is the truth about Herod that the palaces could not hide. He was one of the most capable rulers the ancient Near East had ever produced, a builder of genuine genius, a political survivor of extraordinary skill who had managed to maintain his position through the chaos of Roman civil wars, switching allegiances at precisely the right moments, surviving scenarios that destroyed everyone around him. And he was absolutely, completely, pathologically afraid. The historian Josephus documents the murders with clinical precision. Herod killed his wife Mariamne, the woman he genuinely loved, because he could not stop suspecting her of conspiracy. He killed her mother. He killed two of his own sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, strangled on his orders. He killed another son, Antipater, just 5 days before his own death. The Emperor Augustus, a man not known for sentimentality, reportedly said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. And then there were the pools. The historian Josephus tells us that Herod used those beautiful, gleaming, architecturally perfect swimming pools for something that had nothing to do with leisure. When the young high priest Aristobulus, Herod's own brother-in-law, popular with the people, dangerously charismatic, began to attract too much public affection, Herod solved the problem the way he solved most problems. He invited Aristobulus to swim. His servants held the young man under the water until he stopped moving. Then they reported it as an accident, a tragedy. The high priest had drowned during an evening of recreation. The pools that were built for pleasure became, in that moment, instruments of paranoia. This is what Jericho reflected back at Herod. Every luxury he added, every pool he built, every mosaic he commissioned, it was all, at its foundation, an attempt to build a life that felt secure. A life where the walls were high enough and the comforts sufficient enough that the fear would finally stop. It never stopped. He came to Jericho to die. By the time Herod arrived at his winter palace for the last time, he was consumed by a disease that the ancient sources described in terms that are almost unbearable to read. Josephus writes of a body systematically destroying itself, fever, unbearable itching, intestinal agony, gangrene of the extremities, worms. He tried the thermal baths of the region, the warm springs that had been used for healing for centuries. They gave him no relief. The man who had built the greatest port in the Mediterranean, who had reconstructed the temple in Jerusalem to a scale that made it one of the wonders of the ancient world, who had remade Jericho in his own image, died in his own palace, surrounded by the smell of his own decay, reportedly still giving orders for executions from his sickbed. He had built paradise. He had died rotting inside it. And here is the theological truth that Jericho keeps returning to, chapter after chapter of its long history. The city is a mirror. It does not judge you. It does not punish you. It simply reflects back, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly what you brought into it. Rahab brought faith. She was written into the bloodline of the Messiah. Hiel brought ambition that overrode the fear of God. He buried 2 sons. Herod brought paranoia dressed as power. He built paradise and could not enjoy a single day of it. The spring does not care who drinks from it. The palm trees grow for everyone. The warm air of the valley welcomes the fearful and the faithful alike. But what you carry into Jericho, what you carry into any place, any season, any chapter of your life determines what you find there. Herod spent his life building walls against his fear. More palaces, more pools, more executions of anyone who might threaten him. And in the end, the thing that killed him was not an enemy or a conspiracy. It was what was already inside him. The city he tried to make into his monument became his tomb. What are you building right now, and what is it really for? Is it a gift, or is it a fortress? Is it an act of faith, or is it an act of fear dressed up to look like success? Jericho has seen both, and it has never been wrong about which one lasts. It had been roughly 60 years since Herod's body was carried out of his winter palace. The pools were still there. The mosaics were still beautiful. The palm trees still line the road into the city. But the atmosphere of Jericho had changed in ways that no architectural renovation could address. Rome's grip on Judea had tightened. The tax collectors, publicans, the Romans called them, had turned the city's position at the Jordan crossing into an extraction machine. Every caravan, every merchant, every traveler passing through paid. And the men who ran the collection system grew rich in a way that the people around them experienced as a personal betrayal. Because these were not Roman tax collectors. They were Jewish ones. They were men who had looked at the occupation and made a calculation that the safest, most profitable position in a conquered land was not resistance but collaboration. They took Roman authority and used it against their own people. They were permitted to collect what Rome required and keep whatever they could extract above that amount. The system was, by design, an invitation to corruption. And no one in Jericho had climbed higher in that system than a man named Zacchaeus. The text calls him the chief tax collector, which meant he was not simply corrupt, he was the one who had organized the corruption. He oversaw the other collectors. He took his percentage of their percentages. He was, by any financial measure, one of the wealthiest men in the city, and he was one of the most hated. This matters because we need to understand what Jericho looked like on the day Jesus arrived. It was not a spiritually neutral space. It was a city layered with tension, the tension of occupation, of economic injustice, of a community that had learned to distrust each other because the man sitting next to you at the synagogue might be reporting to the Romans by Monday morning. Into that city, on that particular day, walked Jesus of Nazareth. He was not arriving for a retreat. He was not passing through for rest or reflection. He was on his way to Jerusalem, and everyone who had been following the news of his ministry understood what Jerusalem meant at that moment. The Passover was approaching. The religious authorities wanted him dead. The city was going to be full of pilgrims and soldiers, and the particular combustible atmosphere that Jerusalem produced every year when a crowd of occupied people gathered to celebrate their liberation from an ancient oppressor, while a very present one watched from the fortress walls. This was Jesus' last stop before all of that. He chose Jericho. The road into the city was crowded. Word had traveled ahead the rabbi from Galilee was coming, the one who healed the blind, the one who had raised Lazarus, the one the Pharisees could not silence and the crowds could not stop following. People lined the road, and somewhere in that crowd, on the side of the road where the dust was thickest and the jostling was worst, sat a man named Bartimaeus. He was blind. He made his living begging. He had no social standing, no family mentioned, no community that claimed him. He was the kind of person that a city's crowd manages instinctively push to the margins, kept out of the way, tolerated as long as he stayed quiet. He did not stay quiet. When he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was passing, he began to shout, not a polite request, a shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The crowd around him responded the way crowds always respond to people like Bartimaeus. They told him to be quiet, to know his place, to stop embarrassing himself and everyone around him. He shouted louder, and Jesus stopped. In the middle of the road, in the middle of the crowd, with Jerusalem waiting and the cross waiting at everything that was about to happen waiting, he stopped. He called for Bartimaeus. He asked him the question that sounds almost unnecessary, "What do you want me to do for you?" And then he healed him. Completely. Immediately. On the spot. The crowd that had just told Bartimaeus to be silent watched him stand up and follow Jesus down the road, seeing everything for the first time. But the story of Jericho that day was not finished. Further up the road, a short man was having a problem. He had heard Jesus was coming. He wanted to see him, and the text is careful to say this was not curiosity. Something in this man was reaching for something he could not name. But he was short, and the crowd was deep, and the crowd had no particular interest in making space for the chief tax collector. So Zacchaeus ran ahead, and he climbed a sycamore tree. I want you to feel the full weight of that image for a moment. This was not a young man on an adventure. This was the wealthiest, most powerful, most socially connected man in Jericho, a man whose signature on a document could ruin your business, whose relationship with Rome made him untouchable by any local authority. And he was sitting in a tree like a child, because he could not see over the crowd that despised him. His wealth had given him everything except the one thing he apparently needed most: access. Jesus walked beneath the tree, looked up, called him by name, which means he already knew who was up there and why. And then he said something that inverted every social expectation in the city in a single sentence. "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Not I will consider your case. Not prove yourself worthy and we will talk. Not I see you have a complicated history. I must stay at your house today." The crowd that had surrounded Jesus, the same crowd, presumably, that included peoples Zacchaeus had defrauded, began to mutter, He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. The religious logic of the moment was clear. A righteous teacher does not legitimize a collaborator by eating with him. You maintain your purity by maintaining your distance. Jesus walked into his house anyway. We are not told what was said over that meal. The text moves quickly to the outcome: Zacchaeus standing up and announcing that he would give half his possessions to the poor and repay anyone he had cheated 4 times over. 4 times was double what Jewish law required and more than Roman law demanded. It was not restitution. It was transformation. Something happened at that table that the text does not describe, but the numbers reveal. And then Jesus said something about Jericho that I think is the most important sentence in the entire 12,000-year history of this city. Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. A son of Abraham. Not a traitor. Not a collaborator. Not a lost cause written off by his community and his conscience. A son of Abraham, which meant belonging, covenant, comb. Think about the full arc of what we have walked through together. Joshua came to Jericho with an army and destroyed it. Jesus came to Jericho alone and restored someone. Joshua's victory was visible, dramatic. Seismic walls falling flat, fire consuming the city, a curse spoken over the ruins. Jesus' victory happened at a dinner table, in a conversation we were not given the words to, in the quiet transformation of a man who climbed a tree because he needed to see and came down because he had been seen. Same city. Same road. Same geography that has been the stage for 12,000 years of human longing and divine intervention. Completely different kind of victory. Rahab hung a red cord and was written into the bloodline of the Messiah. Bartimaeus shouted past the crowd that tried to silence him and received his sight. Zacchaeus climbed a tree in broad daylight and came down a different man. Jericho has always been a city where the unlikely ones get found. If this story is stirring something in you, if the idea that Jesus stops for the person the crowd is trying to silence, that he calls by name the one sitting in the tree, if that lands somewhere personal, somewhere real, subscribe. Because this is what we do here. Every single time. We follow the story until it finds us. We started with a question. Why does God keep coming back to Jericho? We have walked through 12,000 years trying to answer it. We watched the Natufians stop beside a spring in the lowest place on earth and build the first walls in human history out of fear. We watched those walls grow higher and more sophisticated until they were the most advanced military engineering of the ancient world, and then fall flat in a single morning because God decided it was time. We watched a woman hang a red cord from her window and end up in the bloodline of the Messiah. We watched a curse hold for 500 years and arrive exactly on schedule. We watched a prophet throw salt into poisoned water and call it healing. We watched the most powerful king in the region build paradise in this valley and rot alive inside it. And then we watched Jesus walk down the same road that Joshua's army had marched alone, on foot, on his way to the cross, and stop for a blind man in the dust and a traitor in a tree. Same city. Every time. Different story. Same God. Here is what I think the answer is. God keeps coming back to Jericho because Jericho is us. It is every place we have built our walls too high and trusted our engineering too much. It is every season where we have tried to construct a life secure enough that we would not need Him. It is every poison spring we have written off as beyond healing and every tree we have climbed in desperation just to catch a glimpse of something we cannot name but cannot stop reaching for. The walls fall. The water heals. The unlikely ones get found. And the God who destroyed this city and then walked through it is still in the business of doing both, tearing down what cannot stand and restoring what seemed beyond recovery. The spring of Elisha still flows in Jericho today. After 12,000 years. After every empire and every curse and every fire and every silence. Some gifts, once given, are not taken back. If this story moved you, share with someone who needs it today. And if these are the questions that keep you searching, subscribe, because this is what we do here, every single time. Leave me a comment. Which moment in Jericho's story hit you hardest? Was it Rahab's red cord? Bartimaeus shouting past the crowd? Zacchaeus coming down from that tree? I want to know. I will see you in the next one.